Good afternoon from London. Welcome to the webinar, Being Digital, What It Means and Why You Need to Change Now. The webinar is hosted by Litmos, and our guests today are the Fosway Group and Paddy Power Betfair. My name is Paul Cooper. I'm the VP for Europe for Litmos, which is the Calidus Cloud company. One slide on Litmos, if I may. Litmos by Calidus Cloud is a simple yet powerful cloud-based platform. It unifies learning management, the extended enterprise, and pre-packaged content in an innovative platform to meet any organization's internal and external training needs. Litmos is built with the learner's experience in mind, which makes it easy to implement, administer, and manage. The platform's open API architecture and pre-packaged connectors make it simple for organizations to connect Litmos to their internal systems. The user interface is consistent across devices, which helps organizations to engage their mobile workforce. Over 5 million users in more than 130 countries and 24 languages use Litmos to improve performance and monetize training. Finally, for those of you who use Salesforce.com, you will be interested to know that we are a Platinum Partner and Salesforce App Exchange certified. Now, Litmos has been rated by Fosway as a core leader in their 9-grid for learning systems. And I'm delighted to inform you that Paddy Power Betfair use Litmos in both their retail and online business as the platform of choice. Our two guest speakers today are David Wilson, who's the Chief Executive of the Fosway Group, and Niamh Ryan, who's Head of Learning for Paddy Power Betfair. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to David Wilson, the CEO of the Fosway Group.
Thanks, Paul, and good afternoon to everybody that's joining on the session. Thank you for coming from Fosway, as well as obviously from Litmos in terms of the event. In case if you're not aware who Fosway is, we're a European-based analyst firm focusing on HR, talent and learning as a market. We mainly operate with European based corporations, and we run a whole bunch of different research processes, market analysis and related other tools. We have a couple of also strategic research partnerships, including with Learning Technologies, who are one of the leading event providers in Europe, and also with HRN on the HR technology side. And some of the data I'm going to talk to you about today relates very much to some of that latest European market research around what's going on in the technology market. So the agenda today, as we've discussed, is really focusing around being digital and understanding what that really means for organizations. So for Fosway, this is a topic that we've been tracking in its kind of entirety really for quite a few years. We recently recalibrated our Fosway 9-grid assessment for e-learning to be based now on what we call digital learning, and that has created a much more diverse set of capabilities, etc., that we're looking for within organizations. And the reason that we looked at this a couple of years ago, and one of the things that we decided around that was that we felt at the point that that we originally started considering that the market wasn't yet fully there in terms of understanding what digital learning was, and we're still really coming to grips with a more broader kind of discussion around digital transformation, whether that's in their core business, digital banking, digital retail, etc., but also in terms of some of the digital functions that will exist within a business. And I think we made the change in 2017 and recategorized a lot of other factors that come under a sort of broader e-learning and learning technology type agenda to look at digital learning, because we felt really the time was there where we really saw organizations as having to come to grips with that. And I think that's obviously behind the core premise of the presentation today and the title of the presentation in understanding what it means to be digital. So if I can refer to some of the research that we've been doing, so this is actually very current. The research took place at the beginning of this year. We're actually still in the process of finalizing some of the reports and some of the deliverables associated with it. So some of the stuff I'm going to talk about here is very new, and as I said, we're still kind of crunching some of the numbers around the consequences of it. We had just under 1,200 participants take part in that research, which means it's grown about 20%. This is the second time we've run this particular survey process, and it's grown about 20% from the year before. We're seeing a lot of engagement around some of the data that's being produced, and hopefully, you'll find some of that interesting today. So one of the core questions, obviously, for us in looking at organizations is really to understand what is driving digital learning for them. Why are they engaging with this? As I said in my kind of introductory comments, what we're seeing within companies is this shift to digital is happening much more generally. Their businesses are becoming digital businesses. Their IT function is now has now moved from being an IT support operation towards really digital being a lead proposition within the business. There's often digital transformation projects in companies. And it's quite clear that we're then seeing that shift go across into the support function. And obviously learning, as an example, is just one of those support functions. Learning has obviously been engaging with the digital market and with e-learning and online learning for a long time, but it hasn't necessarily thought itself as a digital function. And that's one of the things we were really trying to understand. What was the difference and what did they really mean? So on this slide, we have some examples around some of what we see the key drivers for it. Interestingly enough, one of the first things that we also wanted to check was, was this just around headcount reduction? Was it around reducing the amount of face-to-face delivery days? Or was there something more fundamentally going on here? And I think the data pretty much says to itself. The key drivers are all around availability, agility, engagement with the learner population, and yes, there are some things around efficiency, but it's also around the flexibility of learning. So you look at the leading drivers, digital learning, number one is increased learning availability, number two is agility and speed of learning, the ability to reach that audience quickly, flexibly, and so on. Learner engagement also figures pretty highly up there at 83%. And then we've got a few, other things, cost efficiency and so on. If we look at the red ones on the right-hand side, so see these are some of the drivers that they're still scoring, but they have a lower point. At the right at the bottom of those lists was that reducing headcount. Interestingly, HR digital transformation is there, but it's only about a third, just over a third of the organizations that we're looking for. Is HR digital transformation a key driver of digital transformation in learning as well? And then you've got obviously the broader transformations in the business. So you've got a lot of agenda items driving this, but the key ones are around availability, agility, learner engagement, and the kind of flexibility and options that drives around it. And the reason why that is can in some ways be sort of summarized on this slide. And I apologize if the slide is a bit busy and complex. This is what we, from a Fosway point of view, we call our learning ecosystem. So this is a way we've been looking at, actually for some time, the learning, the world of learning within organizations and the different modalities, methodologies, approaches that learning functioners have been trying to engage around. And it's complex. There's the whole left-hand side of that diagram is all around the formal learning. Classroom training, formal e-learning, compliance training, whatever it is. There's a whole set of things in there which come under that formal banner. They're typically the things that you see organizations have in their LMSs historically. They tend to be around the stuff that's pushed at learners and you're trying to get learners engaged with, whether that's structured programs or one-off delivery models and so on. On the right-hand side here, we also have a whole bunch of other types of learning, and there's been a lot of talk within the L&D community around things like 70-20-10, mixing informal and formal learning. the idea that formal learning should only be maybe 10% of the focus, but in reality, things like learning in the workplace and learning from peers and colleagues is, a much higher proportion and percentage. And whether you believe in those numbers or not doesn't really matter. The key thing is learning has always been a much more complicated thing. Lots of people learn on the job. Lots of people learn from engaging with colleagues and so on. And this world is getting more and more complex. It's not getting simpler, it's getting more complex. There are more contexts for learning, there are more strategies for learning. And in reality, the way we're measuring success around learning is also much more complex as well. It's not just around happy sheet scores for training courses anymore. If L&D functions are really starting to focus much more around outcome measures, analytics, and other things as well. So you've got this much more complex environment in which learning is happening. And then on top of that, we need to then play in that digital story and understand how is this focused. And if I can give you one definition of what it means to be digital from a learning point of view, it's around, just like on banking and retail, etc., it's about rethinking what you are, what you do, and how you engage with your customer. And for learning, that's no different. Think about what learning is, how you engage with learners, how you deliver stuff to learners, but the whole kind of value cycle around it is something that needs to be thought about from a much more digitally centric context. It's not just about digital delivery. It's around a whole other bunch of things as well. And I think, hopefully Niamh will talk about what they've been doing from a Paddy Power Betfair point of view later on and align with that message. So what are the key kind of measures of success for digital learning? So interestingly enough, maybe unsurprisingly, we talked about learner engagement being a key thing. So that's pretty high up, 55%. Number one, of course, which is hopefully what you expect to say, is increasing employee capability. So are your employees able to do more and perform better at the end of it? For all that we might want to talk about their ability to access and be happy with it, ultimately the number one measure is still, does it make a difference? And we shouldn't lose sight of that. It's really, really important to focus around that business impact as a central part of the digital learning strategy. Unfortunately, that's something that is, as it says on the side, frequently missing. Learner satisfaction and learner engagement are interesting because one of the things that we've seen, and this is really a byproduct often of the history of e-learning in organizations, where e-learning has focused on being driven by often a compliance agenda. Whether the learners liked it was not really that important, but as digital learning becomes a kind of core and online becomes a core delivery mechanism for the majority, associated with all sorts of topics, all sorts of contexts, as we talked about on the previous slide, the learners being engaged with it and learners actually wanting to do it matters a lot more. And this is almost like the number one driver that we're seeing around selection projects when companies are looking at, platform choices, content choices around it. Not only will it do the business, but will it engage those learners in that process? But at the end of the day, we've still got the other measures around. We can't afford not to be compliant as a business. If that's one of your big drivers, if you're a regulated company or something, that still will kind of be a big issue as well. So these are the sort of things we're starting to see and how that shift to digital is starting to change it. And the core context of that really, in many ways, around really force the learning function to really now think of itself as a digital function. And that's really moving a whole set of kind of processes, thought processes, approaches, away from maybe a historical focus towards that kind of next-gen and a more next-gen digital approach. It flips the value chain. It moves away from being around focusing on learning administration and learning delivery towards learning engagement and learning consumption. The important person now is not the trainer or the learning manager, but actually the learner and maybe their manager and so on. It's not just about being accessed in one place or in one context, but in many places or everywhere. That shift towards that anytime, any place, anywhere agenda, which we talked about with online learning for a long time, is becoming a much more explicit thing, including, of course, from a mobile phone, from the airport, from wherever it is. There's a whole kind of shift around it. And obviously then also driving learning function and outcomes, learning process and outcomes around business and work. the idea about being focused on business performance and business capability rather than necessarily an HR process and view of it. So there's a kind of inversion of the model. It's much more networked. It's much more about all of the people that can access it. And as you said, it's not so much around a formal training context anymore, but about many contexts for it. So the right-hand side of this model, I think, create quite a lot of challenges for most learning functions. And if I can kind of structure that back in a different way, we see a lot of organizations that have talked about things like 70-20-10 as a methodology, but in reality have very little idea about how to really deliver that and change it. And ultimately it's about engaging in all these different elements that will enable you to make that happen. So if that's what we're talking around in terms of the shift, what in reality does that mean in terms of what organizations are doing from a digital learning point of view? So we've structured this kind of, from a research point of view, in looking at it from kind of two main angles. One is what kind of content they're using, and the second is what kind of platforms that they're using. From a content point of view, there are certain things that are very well established in organizations. So e-learning, off-the-shelf e-learning content, whether that comes from a major kind of global library or whether it comes from niche providers or whatever, is pretty established in most organizations. So we've talked about established being more than 65% of organizations are using them. Emerging as being between like 35 and 65, and then the specialist ones where it's kind of less than 35%. So if I look at established, it's bespoke learning content, off-the-shelf content libraries. Interestingly, video now is considered to be mainstream, and in most organizations, that's something that's changed quite a lot within the last couple of years, where there were a lot of concerns and constraints around video, not least because of network bandwidth and availability, and suddenly video now has become a major content type in most organizations. And then some things around that, blended learning as a methodology. Interestingly enough, from a content point of view, organizations are looking at mobile as being an established thing. And I think one of the things there is a question of, in our view is, does that mean it's really systemic? Maybe not, but I mean, it's certainly something which is, within the delivery mix for most organizations. From a niche and emerging point of view, things like gamification, performance support content, simulations, user-generated content. Again, we often find pockets of that in organizations where subject matter experts and individual learners or whatever can create and share content with colleagues. So this is very much in that kind of collaborative learning space and that we talked about within the learning ecosystem model. And then at the more specialist or exploring areas, which is where we've got a lower proportion of organizations, so virtual reality, MOOCs, interestingly enough, again, that's something that's been around for quite a long time. So, online content with large kind of numbers of people and organizations in there. Things like serious games, again, is quite a specialist proposition. And things like augmented reality, again, where you have devices that enable you to kind of interact with the world around you kind of in a different way. So these are all pretty specialist in terms of areas. I think one of the observations I would make is if you go along to any learning technology trade show now, you'll find a lot of organizations, a lot of the suppliers talking about virtual reality as the next big thing, but in reality it has, in real reality, if you like, rather than virtual reality, it's still got a long way to go to actually kind of filter into, I think, the L&D mindset and understand where the role of it is, other than in a very kind of specialist siloed sense. So if that's learning content, what about learning platforms? Again, slightly kind of similar sort of classification. I mean, the kind of main ones, of course, we see a lot are LMSs in organizations and authoring tools to create e-learning content and so on. Vast majority of organizations have got those, particularly the larger ones. We're seeing more of the mid-market engaging in things like LMS propositions as well. You also have things like learning portals, so effectively maybe websites overlaying on LMSs that provide access to learning content, and also maybe some kind of reporting and analytics type tools to support it. In the niche space, or emerging space, we've got mobile learning. So interestingly, it's seen as a more mainstream content type than it's seen as a mainstream platform at the moment, which is something to kind of reconcile. Virtual classrooms, so again, virtual classrooms, whether that's things like we're using today with the GoToMeeting platform, WebEx, and a whole range of different things there. I mean, that's again an area that was quite a big thing maybe 10 years ago, then sort of declined a little bit and has gained a bit more of a renaissance. But again, we're finding a lot of organizations who are using that, but maybe again not systemically. And social learning, there's a lot of interest around social learning, but I think a lot of organizations have yet to work out how to really thread it around all of their main delivery kind of approaches. In other words, it's not really a systemic approach. It's still focused on certain types of areas. And interestingly enough, MOOCs comes in both as a platform as well as a content type as well. I'll come back and talk about that a little bit later on, because there's some interesting things around MOOCs in terms of learner satisfaction and so on. So if that's where organizations are going today, there's some interesting questions we need to ask around them rather than just using them, but also, are you happy with them? Is it delivering value for you, and so on. So one of the things we did in the research is we like asking organizations around their experience of using these solutions, and also their experience actually with vendors as well, because that goes into our market analysis. And when you start asking questions around, for example, do your learning technologies providers exceed the expectations of the learners using them? Exceed maybe is a kind of hard word, but it's interesting when you put some boundaries around that. But you see a very different answers emerging. If you look at the LMS one in the middle, you've got 44% of organizations saying that their LMSs rarely or never, kind of exceed learner satisfaction. And even on learning content, you've got 50% of people saying that learning content only occasionally exceeds expectations. So you can argue that the barrier is high here with exceeds, but actually I think what we're trying to get at here is really how effective are these tools in meeting learner needs and delivering value and impact into the business. So that's a good segue across also to talk about impact, because whilst we can talk about meeting expectations, we also want to know is what is really delivering value and having an impact in the business. So this particular kind of slide is now blowing that all up into looking into the different content subtypes and giving you a sense of the relative degrees of satisfaction around those. And what's clear as you look at the top of those, so bespoke e-learning content is still pretty highly rated by a lot of organizations. The blue bar down the middle is a kind of median line to give you a sense of where kind of the 50% line would be. So they're the only two things where more people are saying effectively that they think they're good or very good, rather than acceptable or poor. Look down the bottom, things like gamification. 20, I think it's about 27% or something like that of organizations saying they're good or better, which means, frankly, by definition, 70-odd%, 73% maybe, are saying they're either only acceptable or poor. And when you look at the poor bit, you've got a pretty high percentage there, something like 38% of organizations saying that gamification actually is not that good. And that's a pretty strong thing. This is one of the whole gamification thing is an example of a really big trend in organizations, and yet many are very skeptical about how good that experience actually is. Similarly, if I mentioned virtual reality earlier, I said go to any trade show and one in 3 or 4 vendors is going to be sat there with some kind of virtual reality story at the moment, and yet 40% of organizations that have looked at virtual reality are saying it's giving it a poor outcome. So, I think there's some really interesting things in there within expectations. You've got some stuff at the top of this which is relatively established, maybe still not that necessarily a completely compelling story. You've got some things down the bottom of this which are these less well-known content types, maybe specialist or niche kind of propositions maybe at the moment, but where actually the success model around these is kind of maybe not what it is, what it should be. If I look at the learning platforms, again, it's a similar profile. Only authoring tools, frankly, are rated at good, very good, above 50%. Virtual classrooms, about 50%. If I look down the bottom, I talked about the customer things around LMS, for example. LMS is rated about 35% or so on. Social learning tools about the same. But again, look on the right-hand side. Quite a high proportion of organizations, 25% of organizations also saying that maybe they're perceived some of these platforms as being poor. So there's a really kind of mixed picture here. And there's obviously when you're looking at a sample size around 1,200 people, that covers a lot of organizations. So some of this data really is actually pretty robust, and it's something that I think organizations really need to be thinking about, both in terms of their supply choices, but also in terms of their execution strategies around how they deliver it. Obviously, one of the other things we want to do is to really understand how things are changing. So what are the growth areas? Learning content, video is kind of #1 area that's growing. I think 80% of all organizations growing the use of video. Mobile, close to that, not far off of it. Blended learning, something that potentially organizations have talked about doing for quite a long period of time, still one of the high growth areas. And then user-generated content, moving away from the L&D function being the only source of learning content towards a more diversified view of where that learning content could come from. Actually, I mean, what's interesting there is it's actually a diversification of what we consider learning content to be, rather than learning content only comes from the L&D function. Understanding how to do that well is still an emerging thing, as we talked about earlier. From a learning platforms point of view, #1 area is around learner engagement. Pretty much every RFP that we see going out into the market is focusing around, almost like as a #1 goal, defining, driving learner engagement. How do we build that into function? So a lot of the vendors, again, are focused very much around beyond just user interface and user experience, around how they build solutions and platforms that can really engage learners. Mobile, again, very high up on the list. I think we've really gone beyond the point now where companies are sitting there thinking about being able to make content available on mobile is an optional thing. That is now becoming pretty much non-negotiable, but it's also forcing different changes in content types, including, as we said on the previous slide, video. So obviously one of the things that's driving growth in video and in user content is being able to use smartphones, for example, as a capture and display vehicle for it. Virtual classrooms, still on that list. As I said, a bit of a renaissance maybe that's coming back. Social and collaborative learning is very high up on the list. It's an area, though, where we find organizations, again, a bit unclear about how in reality they thread that together with their learning solutions. So there's a kind of whole range of different things around that. But the key thing here is it's not just about the technology. So pardon the diagram, it's easy to focus, and this is one of the things that we see a lot of learning organizations do as they push to become more digitally led. Often the agenda is driven by technology selection, but the question is, who is qualified to design these things? Who understands how to deliver digital learning successfully? What does that even really mean? There's a fundamental shift really, and sometimes not just the thought process of what you are, but how you then design, deliver, measure, and engage. And that's one of the things that we, really again, come back to that shift that I talked about earlier within the digital function, seeing that a fundamental shift in how organizations approach this, rather than just having what might be described as a niche digital learning function or sub-function within there, or a learning technology function or an e-learning group that owns this. This is about how the learning team as a whole moves towards it and looks at the skills and so on that it needs to be able to do it. What are the critical drivers around that? Well, number one, or and you might argue it's surprising, 57% of organizations saying this, but the quality of the end user experience. And that is really emerging as a critical measure of success, as we talked about at the beginning. But actually, it's a thing that drives that satisfaction, building that into the central part of your paradigm, your design model, your approach, as well as also your supply chain around how you deliver these things. Because that's the other side of this. It's not just a question of what capabilities you have in terms of your organization. It's not just a question of what strategies you have, it's the supply chain you build about it, the partners, the suppliers, the vendors that you're using. The other key thing around that is things like the expertise that you have internally and the expertise you have in your supply chains. The ability to focus on delivering impact in that, not just measure completion, measure activity. L&D has been really, really guilty in the past of focusing on activity measures, and then addressing up a success maybe as whether somebody liked the event, or being cynical, like the lunch when they went on to it. I mean, it's really around does this stuff really make a difference, and how do I actually deliver that? So focusing around user experience, learner engagement, creating engaging learning experiences rather than activity and delivery for its own sake is really kind of critical. And pretty much that's kind of taken me to sort of the end of what I want to cover in here. There's quite a lot more research data that's available around that stuff. Again, in summary, what is it about being a digital function? It's around shifting away from HR and L&D centric processes towards user and learner centric processes. It's about being networked and online as a start point. It's around rethinking what learning is and how people engage with it, not just how you deliver it, and viewing digital learning is not just another form of delivery. It's around rethinking and changing the way, and that's hence the title. It's about being digital, not just about delivering digital. And on that note, I'd like to hand over to Niamh, who's going to talk to you about what they're doing at Paddy Power Betfair.
Thanks, David. That was really interesting, and I suppose, luckily enough, my personal experience of introducing digital technologies to learners certainly reflects many of the points that you've raised in your presentation. Before getting into a bit of the detail on that, I'd like to share some of the context around where we are on our implementation journey and how we got here. Paddy Power Betfair, for those listeners who aren't familiar with what we do, we're a gaming and sports betting company, and we work online, and we have a retail network of shops as well. And you may be aware that Paddy Power and Betfair merged last year to become Paddy Power Betfair. So my role within the group is head of L&D for retail, which from a branding perspective you can think about as the Paddy Power retail shops that you see on the street in the UK and Ireland. Before the merger, both companies did use Litmos, but mainly they used it to deliver compliance training to office-based staff, while the staff in our shop network didn't have access to the system. So for our retail colleagues, learning was really face-to-face or involved like reading guides, toolkits, or briefers that were prepared by L&D. So I'm pretty new to the company. When I joined the company 6 months ago, I saw an opportunity to use Litmos to develop our shop teams. So, I mean, we looked at a few different options for retail, and in the end chose Litmos because of the user-friendliness of the system and the fact that we had in-house experience of Litmos, and we'd done some work already around linking it up with other internal systems. So in retail, we launched the system in January, and we're currently in the process of transitioning our previous induction system over to Litmos and creating new content for our retail colleagues. So I suppose just to put it in context, I want to highlight that we really are in the early stages of our journey, and over the last few months our focus within the L&D team has been on getting the structure right in order to create a meaningful experience for people. So to get into it then, I mean, based on my experience of implementing learning management systems in other organizations, I know that figuring out what to focus on in the beginning can be challenging. And one of the traps that you can fall into, and certainly is one that I fell into, is to jump straight in and start focusing on getting content online. And that often consists of just putting your current documents and PowerPoint slides onto the system and then telling your learners they have access to e-learning. And I think it ties into David's point earlier just about, really how does that impact the performance and skills of the people who are accessing the system, and really it doesn't. And so why that happens, I think this approach is taken often due to pressure from the business about, and they have sometimes got expectations about how quickly you can get up and running, and they put pressure to demonstrate that the investment that they made in an LMS or whatever system was worth it. So the disadvantage of this approach is that the content doesn't really flow. It isn't consistent, and the learner kind of has to do a lot of work to learn about the system every time they log on, because maybe there's inconsistencies across trainers or across courses. But probably a bigger problem than that is because this approach delves right into the detail, it tends to mean that a digital learning strategy either doesn't exist, or if it does, it sort of exists in a vacuum and it isn't aligned to the overall corporate strategy. So the first step has to be aligning with the corporate strategy. I'm just clicking on my slide there. So, I really would like to focus on that term alignment, because of course digital technologies can support the strategy in that they can help develop people by giving them access to content focused on improving behaviour and skills that drive performance. And in our case, we're developing content to increase knowledge of products and to enhance customer engagement and to help our people develop management skills. So the system that we have means that we'll be able to train our 3,500 people simultaneous, and then that obviously expands the reach of the department and decreases our travel costs. But to me, alignment is a little bit different. It's a little bit more than that. Aligning the digital strategy with the corporate strategy means thinking of your learners as customers and understanding that the employee experience is understanding that the employee experience has an impact on the customer experience. So in our case, on the screen, you can see 6 pillars of our retail strategy outlined. And our content certainly supports people development in that we're developing content for these key areas. But further than that, as a team, we've actually spent time thinking about alignment. So for example, if you're familiar with our brand, you'll be familiar with the playful, cheeky Paddy Power branding and marketing that we use for our customers. So our brand values are so important in the way that we interact with our customers. So for us to align, we've worked to ensure that the look and feel and even the tone of our e-learning reflects the brand. In product, we hold ourselves to exceptionally high standards when we're developing new products and new innovations. So similarly, we need to do that in the learning team as well, and design digital content that considers things like intuitiveness and user friendliness rather than just giving information. And in particular focus for us at the moment, one of our key areas is multi-channel. And our multi-channel team focuses on bringing an online experience to our retail customers. So for us, alignment means we've been able to reflect that strategy in terms of bringing digital to our employees' development and really bringing digital behind the counter. Our commercial team focuses on helping our customers personalize their experience. So again, to align, we in L&D want to help our learners personalize their experience. So rather than pushing everything at them, we want to allow them to be able to draw down learning as they need it, to opt into modules, so that they can really personalize their development and create a journey that's right for them. I suppose a big external factor that really has changed the way that we think about job roles within retail is how society uses cash now. So the decreased focus on cash transactions in retail generally has changed the nature of the role of our staff behind the counter. So our focus on L&D needs to actually be on helping the teams build skills that they need to be successful in the future. So that's really moving from a more transactional approach to a more service approach, and things like video and demonstrations really help to support that, because we're trying to set a standard that is maybe different from what the traditional job role looked like. And finally, I mean, being cost efficient, look, it's important to everything that we do, and an e-learning system obviously supports that by reducing the need to take people off the shop floor and travel to a training venue, which I suppose in retail, when you think about the staff numbers and the geographical spread, it's quite a high cost. But further than that, we want to kind of design really explicit induction paths which will help to decrease the time to competence. So that demonstrates a value add to the business. So as well as corporate strategy alignment, we also we also need to think about aligning with our values. And if values really are to be the way that we do things around here, then the digital learning technology should reflect the values and further help to embed them in the hearts and minds of employees. So as a case in point, I can talk about the Paddy Power Betfair values and what that means for digital learning. So we have five core values that are embedded into our recruitment and performance management processes. And our first one is relentless will to win. So to this point, I'd actually like to speak about gamification, which is a hot topic and is something that David alluded to. Obviously, that value means that at Paddy Power Betfair, we like to play and we like to win. So in our case, gamification fits quite well with the culture, because offline we use things like tournaments and leaderboards to drive a little bit of friendly competition among shop teams. But this mightn't be the case in organisations where competition isn't actively called out. And I think sometimes the failure of gamification is just using it where it doesn't really fit with the purpose or doesn't really fit with the culture of the organisation. So for example, I previously worked for an education company, and in that space we put a lot of focus into social and collaborative learning and peer assessment, because that was quite a good fit for the organisation. So regarding gamification, I would say it's not a case of definitely use it or definitely don't, but it's more of a case of thinking about what works best for your business. And you know, on that, like, our business is a very fast-paced and innovative business. So as an L&D team, I think we need to live the value of agility by using tools that allow us to upskill our teams quite quickly. And to this end, we need to look at what we can use to build content to host on our system. So currently, we're using Adobe Captivate, and that has been a really good tool for us to use. It's helped us to build stuff quite easily, especially considering some of the points that David made about, like, the L&D team maybe wouldn't necessarily have skills to code or write, you know, do a lot of the digital stuff. So using tools that maybe bypass a little bit of it, that definitely has helped us to get up and running quicker than it would have been had somebody had to go off and learn maybe a lot of detail code. So a point on the value around integrity: we will use the system for a lot more than compliance training. Like, traditionally it was used for compliance, but in retail we plan to expand that. But our industry is highly regulated, so I can't overstate the importance for us of having reliable data and record keeping. So for us, that aspect of the system is really, really important. And then the last two values, I mean, I can talk about together. In terms of our value of collaboration, I think for us, the L&D team now, we need to collaborate with subject matter experts. So they supply the content and we advise them how best to land that content. Gone are the days where L&D created all the content from scratch. So really this has been a mind shift for the L&D team and for the business. And it does link into our value around low ego. So we've had to change the way that we think about ourselves as L&D professionals. We've had to let go of the idea that we're experts in all subjects, and just really realize and I suppose publicize the fact that our expertise is in helping people learn, and our role is to tap into the knowledge that the various departments hold, and we're helping to create learning experiences rather than writing content. And that is uncomfortable at the beginning, because maybe the team doesn't have the skills to be successful, and it also means that we're relying on other people to get content to us, and really also means we have to have some of those conversations with various departments and really understand how best we should work together in order for L&D to have maximum impact. So, you know, there is a little bit of letting go of control there, but it's been quite positive in terms of being able to really tap into the knowledge that's already in the business. So on that note, I'd like to share some tips for L&D professionals to build great learning experiences. The most important thing to remember really is that digital technologies are a means to an end, in that they're a tool to support learning. And it always surprises me when L&D specialists forget what they know about engagement and how people learn when they start to incorporate digital into their practice. And I kind of compare it to people you meet who are really empathetic, authentic communicators face-to-face, but then maybe become abrupt or robotic via email. So the principles of communication are the same, but the channel is a little bit different. So too with learning, the principles of adult learning are the same, but the mode of delivery is different. So I'd say don't forget the basics. The next point is just to go bite-sized. Split the module into manageable chunks. The digital landscape that we all operate in outside of work means that we're used to short, sharp chunks of information. So manageable chunks mean that people can do a little bit of learning regularly rather than putting it off until they have a large space of time, which, I mean, in retail you would hope that people wouldn't have a large space of time. I would also say don't equate viewing with learning. So if the goal is really to drive performance in the workplace, clicking and viewing content doesn't mean that the learner is motivated or even able to transfer those skills. So you really do need to think about how you can support transfer through real-life application and assessment where necessary. And in our case, like we've designed and are designing toolkits for managers to use with learners after they've completed the online session to make sure that that learning is transferred over. I'd also say don't do a sheep dip. Everybody doesn't need everything. So we might want to push some topics to everybody like compliance or health and safety, but definitely look to create content that learners can opt into and draw down by themselves. Again, align the content with the brand, maybe ask marketing for some guidelines, and just think about the approach to match your customer experience. So you want to have the tone matching up. And finally, think about the outcome that you're trying to achieve and then select the tool rather than the other way around. So for example, if you need a manager to sign off on something, an online checklist might be useful. If you're trying to drive engagement, a social media campaign to drive user-generated content might work. If you need to assess knowledge, an online assessment could work for you. For skills, maybe you need to do something else. So, you know, you want to, rather than thinking, this is what I have and this is therefore what I'm going to use, think about what it is that you're trying to achieve. Okay, so my final slide then is just to cover off the final piece of the jigsaw, which is to think about the L&D team and how to build digital competence there. So to start, I'd suggest sharing the big picture with the team. So you want to help them to understand the corporate and learning strategies and show how digital technologies can support and align with the strategies. So you also have to help the team understand the skill set required to be effective in L&D. So when I started working in L&D, it was good enough to just, you know, be a great deliverer of training, whereas now being able to define and report on learning metrics, delivering content digitally, they're really important skills to add to a JD. You also have to make time for development. So I think L&D departments can be really guilty of not developing themselves. They spend lots of time developing everybody else and totally forget about their own development in some cases. So I think an L&D manager can use one-to-ones or performance conversations to identify opportunities for development and then set goals to close the gap. And the CIPD has a really useful profession map which can help you structure these conversations with your team. And I would also suggest that where possible, choose a development option that encourages your team to learn digitally so that they start to relate to the experiences of online learners. So for example, they could take an online course, they could watch a TED Talk, or they could listen to a podcast. And then my final tip is just to make it easy to scale by spending time building the structure. So think about your learners here. They should have the same experience when they log on to various courses so that they don't have to relearn the basics every time they go into a new course or they have a new tutor. So incorporate your brand values and get some templates together so that your team can build upon them. And you can also decide around conventions, around course names, layouts, assessments, so that there's consistency across the team. So while this might seem like a little bit of a boring thing to spend time on, it really impacts the user experience, and it means that they'll have a consistent experience when they log on. So that takes me to the end of my presentation. As I mentioned, we're at the beginning of the journey and have a bit of a way to go before our entire user population is interacting with the system on a daily basis. But certainly spending time at the start of the project getting the basics right has helped us to structure our learning, and I think it will support the L&D team as well as the learners as we continue to move forward with our digital journey.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Niamh. That's superb. I've got a few questions, and they've been asking questions, our participants have been asking questions since the beginning, so I'm just going to jump back. David, I think this question's to you. It's from Derek Parson. The question is around some of your statistics and research. Is it specific to Europe only, or is it worldwide?
So good question. The learning technology research that I referred to earlier is mainly, I would say, I think from a overall perspective, something like about, I should have the number in front of me, high 80%, something like that, European participants. We actually track location of the person as well as the headquarters of the company as part of that research process. But we've tried to deliberately focus on what we call kind of EMEA and international markets from a research point of view rather than, let's say, US or North American centric. So we're really trying to understand how those trends are playing out here. I mean, obviously there's an overlap, a heavy overlap between sort of trends that we see in the US market and that we see within Europe, but often the complexity of organizations in Europe, multinational, multi-regulatory, DNA, complex DNA of the organizations means that often some of those trends don't manifest themselves in the same way. So yeah, we are gearing it more towards an international audience, and I think in this particular data set it was something like 80% of those, or high 80s, were actually European based.
Okay, thank you, David. And I've got a question from Deirdre Shapiro. I'll ask that to you, if I may, Niamh. Deirdre says her company is struggling with choosing creative e-learning that is adaptable to mobile or more interactive content, such as games, for learning satisfaction. What do you see companies choosing? Is there more value to be accessible or enjoyable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, for us, I can only talk about the ones that I suppose that I've used. We've had quite a lot of success with Captivate in terms of creating games, but yeah, I would say accessibility is more important, because, you know, if you look at anything around evaluating the impact of learning, there is no really clear link between what the users say they enjoyed and what they actually do. So I think as an L&D professional, I think it goes back to David's point, like, we can throw out statistics and say, yeah, 9 out of 10 learners thought that was brilliant, but if they actually don't change their behavior on the job, then effectively you haven't really done, we haven't done our job as L&D professionals. So I think accessibility is the most important. And I really wouldn't do gamification for gamification's sake. Like, I think initially, unless that's really part of your culture, and I do really believe that for us it is a little bit part of the culture, I don't know that you'll really get the value out of spending an awful lot of time on gamification just to do a game, because the novelty of that will wear off, and then after that, then the learning, they still need to do the learning. So I think getting the learning right is the most important thing. Like, that's the basic of being an L&D professional, and then thinking about making it work for digital is kind of important. I don't know, David, you might have other opinions or something else to add on that.
Well, yeah, I think I agree with all of that. I think one of the other interesting thing is getting the learning right. What does that actually mean? And I think ultimately it comes down to the fact that the measure of that as a success point of view is around are people actually doing it? Is it making a difference? Are they engaging with it? And are they changing behavior, if that's what it's process of driving? And I think sometimes the view of success that L&D has had of itself has been kind of very formalized and actually not very successful, if I put it on those terms. It's been measures of, as I said, it's about measures of activity and satisfaction, which is more about satisfaction of the event rather than of the outcome or the learning that was delivered. And we can talk about Kirkpatrick to the cows come home effectively around things like this. But at the end of the day, you know, what really matters, and I think within the digital world generally, but especially, you know, and equally within learning, it's ultimately around, you know, are people engaging with this, and is it doing the business, if you like? Is it delivering the outcome that we're looking at to do? And I think ultimately a lot of the artificial measures that have been surrounding L&D around this in some ways are getting kind of stripped back, and it becomes down to much more basic things. And ultimately that still means in some cases, you know, have they done the stuff and can they show they're competent, or are they compliant, and have they done that certificate that enables them to sell that product or log on to that system? You know, there's some very basic things that need to be there as well. So those drivers around why people do learning, why they have LMSs haven't gone away, but we also now need to be able to meet an expectation that is very different to what we had before. Those are not the only drivers or measures of successful organizations, and that's the magnitude of the change.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you, Nick. Another question here. What is needed is management engagement to measure the training success. So, Niamh, how do you recommend to engage the management?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think any big L&D project needs high level support. So I think a really important thing is to have conversations with managers and really understand what their pain points are. So, like, and especially, okay, for my case in point, retail, like our managers are data driven, their bottom line, they're operational, right? So that's the impact that they want to see, and they know maybe some of the gaps, but they sometimes aren't as clear about stating things in maybe a behaviorally stated learning objective, for example. So they can tell you what's wrong, but they maybe don't know what the standard that they're looking for. So I think when you interact with managers, you need to be able to have those conversations and ask the right questions to uncover where the performance gaps are, or where the skills gaps are, or where the knowledge gaps are, and then also understand what they will accept as measures of success. Because like David said, like happy sheets probably aren't going to cut it, and I agree with that, but you can sometimes be surprised at what managers would look for in terms of a successful outcome, and it's important to understand that at the start. You know, and I think as we in L&D move away from we're the content experts or we're the specialists, linking in with management and high-level management to get their knowledge and skills, and even to get them to launch the project. So like today I was at a meeting, and I'd videoed all our senior leaders talking about the e-learning system, because they do talk about it, but actually often the learners are not going to hear that. So I think it's important to see them engaging with the system as well. And if you can capture those success stories, that's quite powerful, and really involve them from the start, involve them in the trial, involve them in pilots, because if you go too far down and it's not what they want, it can be costly and a little bit embarrassing, I think, to go back and retrace your steps.
Okay, that's great, Niamh. I've got a few more questions, so I'm going to ask this one to David. So David, Amit from India says, do you feel digital learning will be able to replace face-to-face in developing countries?
Oh, in developing countries, I like the little kick on the tail of that one. I think sometimes it would be faster replacing some of these things in developing countries than it is in you know, old world countries. I mean, if I can put it in those terms, or in terms of the because I mean, one of the things that's kind of interesting, and is you look at technology adoption, growth of things like, you know, smartphones, and a lot of developing countries kind of were able to, you know, to avoid almost the legacy trap of fixed line technology and move towards mobile technology a lot faster, because they didn't have it. They just skipped a whole generation and went to it. And I think one of the things that we're seeing with the digital learning is it's driven by this thing. I mean, nobody's used the term yet, but often you hear the expression, the kind of consumerized user experience. And I think that's ultimately what we're starting to see now, because in the general personal and business world now uses technology all the times, you know, whether it's, you know, and it's, that experience is driven much more now by what you do on your smartphone and the app generation and everything else like that. I think it's kind of, we've moved towards a point where the desire to force people to go on formal training as the only mechanism that they can engage with this is, you know, it's kind of disappearing rapidly. We look at a lot of different types of learning activity, you know, whether that's technology training, leadership, sales training, or whatever. You know, there's big shifts in the way that organizations want to consume that. And you take that then into a developing world type scenario where, you know, physical infrastructure is often more limited. Frankly, the travel distances and costs and the costs around that become very prohibitive. In reality, it almost becomes the only game in town. And if you can deliver that in, as Niamh was talking about, bite-sized, consumable things that are easy to access and actually really deliver an outcome for somebody, I think in reality the issue is not about will they replace face-to-face training, but actually finding the reasons why you need to do face-to-face training and then using that in a much more targeted way. It's almost and that for me is what about being digital is. It's about an inversion of the model. It's not about adding digital to a face-to-face or a physical business. It's about flipping the model so that it's digitally native, and yet you still might want to go to an ATM or a branch. You might, for a bank, you might still want to go to a store because you want to try stuff on or whatever it's going to be. what does that mean in learning? It's about really when you want to have a face-to-face activity, it really needs to be a high value impact type experience. So yeah, I think there's a couple of elements to that, but in reality we're well on that shift now, and we're really starting to see learning functions starting to think about or having to reinvent themselves to be basically digitally led, and that's I think the consequences of what we're talking about.
Okay, David, thank you very much. Niamh, thank you very much indeed. We've used up our hour. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you, David. Thank you, Niamh. You can see on your screen there David's email address. If you'd like to send questions to us at Litmos, you could address it to sales@litmos.com, or you can just write to me, Paul C at litmos.com, and I will ask David and or Niamh to answer those questions as well. So once again, thank you very much indeed. The webinar is over. Have a great day.